for me, it was also kind of a process of like iteration. Like there were certain things where when they showed up, they started to feel really right. For me, one of the sort of the doorways in was like I have this like sound installation that I built mostly using Max MSP, but there was some Ableton at the end just to let me work with specific sound files like more quickly and kind of in a different way. But a lot of the sounds were or all the sounds were generated in Max because they're just like many, many sine waves. And a big breakthrough for me was when I started to put samples from the sound installation into like a sampler, um, like in Ableton, so that I can kind of improvise with those sounds, and I'd have like short sounds or I'd have longer sustained sounds, but it immediately put me in a place where every sound that I was making was really coming from my own like language. Um and that opened up just a bunch of kind of intuitive space about things that I wanted to have happen in a piece of music, in the stuff that I was doing. And then as I kind of like moved forward into working with more kind of familiar sounds, whether it's like sine waves or like saw waves, or there were some really nice kind of like almost like flute-like synthesizer sounds. So as I kind of moved back into, the world of like synth sounds that I didn't build from scratch, basically. Um, I already had kind of been able to create like a series of gut feelings about what I was trying to make, but I was starting to crave like having, like a saw sound that's going to be more that's going to be like brighter or more intense or something like that. Another thing that you can really discover a lot with, I think, has to do with rhythm. Um, and I guess the way that rhythm will work probably partially depends on the gear that you're using. Um, but for me, a really big sort of unlock that I had to do with mapping different like using LFOs, not as like a sound generating tool, but like just as like a thing that would like play with like a parameter, and mapping different types of LFOs to basically like different like volume settings so that I get different levels of like swells and pulses and stuff like that. And so for me, I started to feel like I was really getting somewhere when I started to get these sort of like rhythmic shapes where I'd have all these different like pulses that were happening at different rates. And maybe the rate of the different pulses was changing, but not so much necessarily in like a super Steve Reich sense where it's like kind of in the mid range and that's what you're supposed to focus on. It's more just like I just was able to sort of start to create this like rhythmic personality that I could apply to the sounds that I was working with, where it unlocked something. It yeah, I think I might have to talk about it for a while to figure out exactly what it was that it unlocked because I haven't finished the music yet. I'm still kind of in the middle of it. Um, but so there was that like accessing, I guess, very fast rhythmic things like sounds that are like, you know, and then once I had sounds like that, like this is something that I was talking about with Elijah and Riley on a call where Elijah asked me about my like sketching process. But basically, something that's been useful for me is like just putting something down so that there's a context, and then when I'm making decisions, I'm like reacting to the thing. So I'm no longer just acting on like a blank slate, like I'm acting in response to something. And then I can even get rid of the first thing, but it just is a way to like get me going. And so something that has been really useful for me is thinking about sort of contrasts between sounds, including like, well, I mean, there are so many different ways that can manifest, but one of the things is like if I have all these fast like types of sounds, and maybe those are all like super super high frequency sounds, I might just like slam on like a low bass synth that's like, and so there's that like contrast there. Um, yeah, and just by starting to play with like extremes and play with contrasts, some really interesting things were starting to open up. And so yeah, I mean, whether it's like very, very fast, it sounds with very, very fast, but like periodic attacks. And by periodic, I mean like occurring in a regular rhythm. It's like as opposed to like like, and there's also room for that. The more kind of like non-periodic, kind of like glitchy sounds. But even that's the thing, like periodic sounds versus non-periodic sounds. Just starting to like get into the world of Yeah, I mean, get into the world of sounds and use, I mean, contrast can be super useful. And then there can also be times where you might not necessarily want contrast. But I think that if you're experimenting with contrast as you go, then you're going to find really interesting things. And you can choose at a certain point to like be like, I'm going to focus on this one sound, or this one type of sound, or this one type of rhythm for a track or for an album or for, you know, a 10-second part of a track, like on any time scale. But I think that when you can get like iterative with things, like I think working with contrast would be a really useful way to start to discover options. Because if you try to commit really hard to like the third sound that you find, which I did initially, the sound might not be as interesting as something that you'll just find through a bunch of just trying a bunch of things and creating contrast and like iterating with contrast and stuff like that. Yeah, and so I guess when it comes to just like experimenting with sound, those are things that I think about. And I feel like the way that I'm trying to talk about it, and I think the way that I think about it is like general enough um that it can kind of apply across genre. And so like the specific types of rhythms that I was just singing are like a low intense bass synth, those have like a vibe to them. I don't totally know how to characterize like what the vibe is. But there is some sort of like stylistic space that they like kind of describe. But it also applies to even to, like writing guitar music. Like if you have like a higher like finger picked fast guitar part and like a, you know, a slower lower like other guitar part or like a lower bass part, you can start to create contrast that way. Um yeah, and so I think these are just things that I think about that could help you start to, yeah, start to like iterate and begin to be able to like discern between types of sounds or types of components of sounds that are going to be most appealing to you, and things that might not be as interesting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
With something like guitar lessons, like I want to play that Robert Fripp solo, or like this is the sound I'm going for, versus with this class, it's more about finding your sound, which I think is extremely important if you're trying to create like meaningful music that connects with people, but also with yourself. Like none of us are blank slates. Everybody coming into this course identifies in some way or another as an artist or a musician who, again, hasn't necessarily unlocked what they want to unlock.